Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is, well, it's focused on examining a challenge I think is profoundly relevant for a lot of us.
It really is.
We're talking about how cultural traditions, even the ones we love, the ones steeped in nostalgia, are grappling with their own, often violent histories.
And it forces us to ask some really tough questions. What were we celebrating? And more importantly, what uncomfortable truths are we erasing when we do?
Exactly. And we're going to use the sources you shared with us to look at two big examples of this kind of cultural reckoning.
We are. We're going to start with a major European celebration as a sort of lens for understanding the shifts happening right now with U.S. Thanksgiving.
Right. And the sources jump right in with a very personal story. We start in the Netherlands with the tradition of Sinterklaas and his helper, Zwarte Piet.
Or Black Pete.
Black Piet, right. The writer talks about their childhood in Stuttgart, part of their Dutch-German heritage, and celebrating this festival.
And that personal framing is just so essential here. It shows us a tradition that's, well, it's actively in transition. For the writer, the memory is pure nostalgia.
Just sitting on Santa's lap, Zwarte Piet hands over a present. It's a simple, happy childhood memory.
It was an unchallenged, rooted experience for them.
Okay, but for anyone listening who might not be familiar with this tradition, we have to clarify what Zwarte Piet historically looked like. Because this detail is everything.
It's critical.
When the source refers to the overtly racist nature, what are we actually talking about?
Well, historically, Zwarte Piet involves people, usually white people, in full black makeup. We're talking brightly painted red lips, sometimes exaggerated features, and this sort of elaborate, historic-looking clothing.
So it's blackface.
It is. I mean, it's a direct parallel to blackface and minstrel traditions. Now, proponents of the tradition often argue against that. They'll say the black skin is just soot from coming down the chimney.
Which explains why the source mentions that friends from Anglo-Saxon backgrounds were often just shocked when they first saw it.
Of course. That connection to blackface is the core of this whole critical turning point. The writer moves to the Netherlands in 2009, and just a few years later, people of color start speaking out.
Powerfully and publicly.
Yes, about the immense hurt and just the racism inherent in the tradition.
And the sources describe this really interesting moment of cognitive dissonance for the writer.
It's fascinating. They said because they grew up with it, because it was their tradition, it had never been an issue for them personally. Their own experience was completely positive.
But that personal view just couldn't hold up. Not when confronted with the reality of this collective harm, recognizing how deeply offended people of color were.
And that right there, that's the thesis of this whole deep dive, isn't it?
It is. It's that transition from your own personal nostalgia to acknowledging a much larger systemic pain.
Which led the writer to what they saw as an inevitable conclusion. Zwarte Piet had to change.
Right. If Sinterklaas was ever going to be considered inclusive, if it was going to be relevant in a modern society, this had to happen. The tradition's survival really depended on it transforming.
And the incredible thing is, that transformation shows that this kind of cultural change, difficult as it is completely possible.
So what does it look like now?
Well, the sources confirm that today, many Dutch communities have successfully evolved the tradition. The blackface caricature is, for the most part, widely rejected.
And instead
you find pieces that are yellow or orange, multicolored, sometimes gray. And they're often explicitly shown as soot-smudged.
Ah, so they keep the chimney explanation, but without the racial caricature.
Exactly. It's a powerful example of a community choosing inclusion over a static and, frankly, harmful tradition.
It's interesting to think about the psychology there. I mean, it must take a huge effort to confront something that feels so basic to your own identity, to your childhood.
Oh, absolutely. For many, defending the tradition wasn't about defending racism. It was about defending their memories. The shift required them to separate the figure of Sinterklaas, who they loved, from the harmful depiction of his helper.
Okay, so let's unpack this Dutch model now and apply that same critical lens to the United States, because the source argues that U.S. Thanksgiving is on a very similar path.
A similar trajectory of cultural reckoning, yes. But maybe, just maybe, with a heavier weight of resistance.
Resistance is the right word. The observation in the source is very telling. The writer says that many of their American friends are far less critical of Thanksgiving than of Zwarte Piet.
Which is fascinating, right? Because the historical issues around Thanksgiving are arguably much more consequential. We're talking about land, genocide, the entire foundation of a nation.
So why do you think that difference exists? Why is it easier for someone to critique a regional European folklore than a huge national American holiday?
I think it's because Thanksgiving isn't just a holiday. It's a national origin myth.
It's the story America tells about itself.
It is. It's a story of cooperation, survival, benevolence. It just smooths over the violent reality of colonization. Sinterklaas is folklore. Thanksgiving is, well, it's central to the American narrative.
So to challenge Thanksgiving is to challenge something much deeper.
You're challenging the foundation of American exceptionalism, and that makes the cognitive dissonance, so much deeper and the defense so much fiercer.
And just like the Dutch tradition had its turning point, the U.S. has had this decades-long, very deliberate counter-celebration. The source points to 1970.
1970, yes.
Yeah.
A group of indigenous people declared the National Day of Mourning.
Observed on the exact same day as Thanksgiving, the fourth Thursday of November.
It was a powerful statement. It signaled that what the nation was celebrating as a moment of joy was, for indigenous communities, a day of grief and remembrance.
And it gets to the core issue. The source calls it an indisputable fact that the traditional narrative, the one we all learned in school,
Pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a happy feast.
That it just completely overlooks the indigenous perspective. It flattens this complex, brutal history into a simple story of friendship.
A simple and very misleading story.
We really need to dive into that history now because the source material is crystal clear on this. The reality of that 1621 gathering is just so much more sobering than the myth.
It really is.
Let's start with the Wampanoag tribe. The source says they were forced to ally with the Pilgrims, but only after a catastrophe had already hit them.
Precisely. And we're talking about a scale of devastation that you just never hear about in the elementary school version of the story.
Which was?
European diseases. They had already swept through the region and wiped out an estimated 90% of the Wampanoag population.
Wait, 90%? Before the feast?
90%. Before that first harvest feast. So the Wampanoag weren't meeting the Pilgrims as equals. They were a decimated people, functionally compromised, who needed a strategic alliance just to survive against other hostile tribes.
Wow. That completely changes the meaning of the alliance. The traditionalist view celebrates the Wampanoag sharing their food and knowledge.
Right, teaching them to grow crops, which is, without a doubt, why the Pilgrims survived that first brutal winter.
But it frames it as this purely friendly gesture. It ignores that the Wampanoag were acting out of, desperate necessity.
A necessity driven by the immediate catastrophic effects of colonial arrival. That initial devastation is the context the traditional story works so hard to erase.
So the Pilgrims were only able to survive because the people who originally lived on that land had mostly died from the diseases the Europeans brought with them.
It's a very sobering detail,
yeah,
and one you have to confront if you want to have an honest reckoning with the holiday.
And then there's a rapid collapse of that partnership. The source details that this period of friendly coexistence was incredibly brief.
Almost immediate. The alliance broke down as more and more settlers arrived.
Which meant more land was seized from the Wampanoag.
And that inevitably led to escalating violence. This is where the source provides details that they fundamentally undermine the whole idea of Thanksgiving as a peaceful harvest celebration.
In what way?
The Thanksgiving celebrations themselves became intertwined with military conquest.
That's a difficult thing to hear.
It is. In 1637, for example, the governor of Plymouth declared a day of Thanksgiving. But it wasn't for a good harvest. It was specifically to celebrate the successful, brutal massacre of over 700 Pequot men, women, and children.
700.
Over 700. The sources describe this horrifying moment where the Pilgrims trapped the Pequot in a stockade and burned them alive. The celebratory day was literally a day of thanks for mass murder.
That detail, the scale of it, and the fact that it was celebrated, that's precisely what the traditional narrative obscures.
Absolutely. It works so hard to sanitize that history. And the violence didn't stop there. By 1675, the Wampanoag themselves were brutally subdued in what was called King Philip's War.
And the source material is very direct about what happened next.
Unequivocal. It further links that foundational alliance to its ultimate tragic end. Thousands of Wampanoag were killed. Their chief, Metacomet, was beheaded.
And his family.
His wife and children were captured and sold into slavery.
So you go from this supposed alliance to massacres and slavery in just a few decades.
A very short span of time.
Given that history, the source summarizes the personal choice pretty bluntly. It says it's a no-brainer not to celebrate traditional Thanksgiving.
But, just like the Sinterklaas tradition, there is a path forward here. The tradition is also evolving. People are trying to find ways to have inclusivity and reconciliation.
They probably can't just erase the holiday from the calendar.
Right. So they're actively changing how they observe it.
So what does that actually look like? For people who are trying to be more sensitive, what does decolonizing the holiday even entail?
Well, it starts with moving past that triumphant story of colonial survival and introducing practices that actually honor Indigenous sacrifice in history.
Okay, so things like what?
It can range from serving Indigenous foods, like squash and beans, but doing it with an awareness of the history, to offering dishes that are explicitly called decolonized, to shift the focus.
And I saw one of the most significant practices mentioned is the spirit plate. Can you explain the importance of that specific gesture?
Yes. The spirit plate is a really tangible way to do this. You set aside a small offering of food, you place it outside or return it to the earth, and it's done to honor Native American ancestors and acknowledge the victims of colonial violence.
So it transforms the holiday table from just a celebration of conquest into something more.
Into a moment of remembrance. It's an admission that this land and this celebration, it all comes at a cost. It creates a space for reflection right there alongside the feasting.
That seems like such an essential step. It focuses on remembrance instead of erasure.
It is. But the source material also points out the tension around these practices. Some argue that symbolic gestures, like changing a recipe or setting a plate, aren't enough.
If they aren't tied to actual structural change.
Or active advocacy for Indigenous rights today. It's a valid critique.
Which brings us back to the personal standard that the writer of the source sets for themselves. They draw a really clear line.
They do.
They say they usually abstain from celebrating Thanksgiving with American friends unless the invitation mentions practices that acknowledge the many Indigenous victims.
They're looking for invitations that are trying to make the day genuinely reconciliatory. It shows that the intention behind it is key.
That intentionality seems to be the thread connecting both of these stories.
Absolutely. The movement away from Zwarte Piet was an act of intentional inclusion. The movement toward decolonizing Thanksgiving is an act of intentional reckoning.
Both show that traditions, well, they aren't static. They're dynamic. They're social constructs, and they have to adapt.
They have to, especially when parts of them cause deep offense or, actively erase key truths and tragedies from our history.
The common thread, then, despite all the differences, is this move toward accountability.
And inclusion. The survival of any tradition in a modern, inclusive society really depends on the willingness of people to look at their own history truthfully. It forces us to examine our own cognitive dissonance and ask, what myths am I clinging to, and who do those myths harm?
Which leads us to our final thought for you to consider, and it brings us right back to that difficult historical root. Given that the Wampanoag tribe was already decimated by European diseases, suffering a 90% fatality rate before they aided the Pilgrims, does the survival story we all celebrate truly represent a genuine, amicable alliance?
Or was it, more accurately, an act of desperate necessity? An act driven by the immediate catastrophic effects of colonial arrival?
And what are the profound implications for the holiday if we retell the story through that lens of initial devastation and desperate strategy rather than initial friendship? Something profound to chew on as you move forward with your knowledge.